Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and joining me, as always, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, it is always great to have you.
Brandon, great to be on with you, as always.
Hey, listen, a couple of exciting bits of news. One of them is that the Word on Fire show is now being aired on the EWTN radio network. This is great. So you can still listen to the show as a podcast and download it. We recommend that. But now you can also hear the show on radio across the country through EWTN's radio network. It's airing every Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. So thanks so much to our friends at EWTN for picking it up. And we encourage you to spread the word for this show so you can listen to it wherever you are all around the country. Now, Bishop, you just returned from an exciting event in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a conference put on by the wonderful St. Vincent's Arch Abbey, which is the largest Benedictine community now anywhere in the world, which I think is fascinating. It's the first one founded, by the way, in our country, back in the mid-19th century. Anyway, they sponsored this symposium. Cardinal Wuerl of Washington was very much behind it, and he asked me specifically to come. It was largely addressed to campus ministers. It was on evangelization and higher education. So I gave a presentation, and Cardinal Wuerl did, and so did Carolyn Wu, who's the head of Catholic Relief Services. And then we had a lot of time, in between to talk and have Q&A and round tables. So I found it very edifying to be with these campus ministers who are among, I think, the most effective evangelizers in the church today.
Now, those two bits of news are kind of a good segue into our topic, both radio and evangelization, because those are the two things you think of when you think of the person Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. Fulton Sheen is described by many as an apostle of the new media, maybe the first televangelist, at least in America. Give us a little introduction to who was Fulton Sheen.
Yeah, great figure, born 1895 in a little town called El Paso, not Texas, but Illinois, in the Peoria diocese. So he comes of age there and becomes a priest of Peoria. And then very early on, he's sent for advanced studies. He gets this agrégé degree, which is an advanced philosophical degree from Louvain University over in Belgium. And he comes back briefly, does some parish work, but then is brought into teaching at Catholic University of America. And for many, many years, he taught there, but then got involved in more popular preaching and teaching. He had been a public speaker, a giver of retreats, that sort of thing, traveling around the country quite a bit. But then he got on a show called The Catholic Hour, which was a radio program that was widely listened to. And Sheen becomes the voice of the Catholic Church in many senses in the U.S., and then, of course, by the 1950s, he's the head of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, which is an international organization, but headquartered in New York, and then becomes an auxiliary bishop of New York. And then right after that, he becomes most famous for his television program, Life is Worth Living, that came on in the 1950s on major network television in America. He wins an Emmy Award, which I find extraordinary, in the era of, Jackie Gleason and Milton Berle and Bob Hope and Frank Sinatra, that period. And Sheen was right up there with these top figures. Continues into the 1960s, eventually becomes, as a relatively older man, becomes the Bishop of Rochester, New York. Served in that capacity for a handful of years. And then he passed away in 1979. In fact, I remember distinctly, I was just a beginning student at Catholic University studying philosophy when Sheen died. And there was quite a celebration at Catholic U because of his long association with it. I knew him as a kid through my parents. My parents were great admirers of him. But frankly, my generation didn't have that much of a connection to him. He wasn't on TV anymore. This is pre-internet and all that, pre-EWTN. And so we didn't have that much contact with him. My father, who was a tough guy to please when it came to, speech making and performances, had a very deep devotion to Fulton Sheen. So that's how I knew about him. But along with many others, I kind of discovered him later on as the generation I was training at Mundelein Seminary got clued into Fulton Sheen.
Whenever people ask you, what's the best way to get involved with this sort of media evangelization work, you always tell them first, way before you pick up the keyboard, way before you turn on the camera, way before you pick up a microphone, read, read, read. Study, study, study. You got to know the tradition before you share it. And Sheen's a great example. I mean, he got his doctorate in philosophy from Louvain, and then his sacred theology doctorate from the Angelicum. So for years and years before he was on radio, he put in the hard work of study. That's a good model, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I always think of him when I make that comment. And not only was he a great student, he taught for many years. He taught at a very high level at Catholic U. So he was a bona fide academic who could have pursued a very successful, purely academic career. And, to be honest, though, if he had done that, maybe a handful of specialists would know about him today. He would have written, high-level learned books that maybe would have had a trickle-down effect. But to your point, yes, he was deeply informed about the Catholic tradition before he went on to popularize it. He said, and I believe him, that he read every single word written by St. Thomas Aquinas in Latin. And that's no easy task, just from a physical standpoint, because Thomas wrote so much. I'm a great student of Thomas, but I can't say that I've read every single word he's written. I believe Sheen when he says that. And he was a Thomist. I mean, that comes through all the time in his speaking. He had, that's important too, I think, he had a touchstone philosophy. He ranged around, smart man, well-read, but he had a touchstone philosophy that provides the foundation for everything he said.
Today in our television culture, we have hundreds and hundreds of channels, so it's somewhat unsurprising when you see Fulton Sheen show up on EWTN and some replays or something like that. But back in his day, when he's on TV, he's on network TV, like the equivalent of ABC, NBC, CBS, at a sort of primetime slot, Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. Talk about the significance of a Catholic priest essentially preaching on network TV in a primetime slot.
Well, it's huge, and it's almost, as you suggest, impossible to imagine today. In those days, there were basically three channels. I mean, three major television networks, and he's on one of them. And as you say, in prime time, we're not talking about 4:30 in the morning. He was on 8 o'clock at night. Hard to imagine it even happening today when we have a million different channels, in these different social media formats. But, what he did is he got high-level sponsorship. Sponsors paid for him because he was a very lucrative commodity for them, and because people watched his show. So I don't know if that could happen today. The media scene has changed so dramatically. But, nevertheless, I think we do it. We do what he did. You just launch yourself out there and try it and see what works. The other thing, too, about Sheen is he was addressing a much more homogenized culture. What I mean is whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, I mean, there weren't many atheists in those days, maybe a handful. Most people were religious in the three major categories. But there was such a consensus about moral issues, about the family, about what it meant to be a human being, that he could speak out of the Catholic tradition, but yet appeal across the board. One of the other problems, just as the number of media outlets has kind of splintered, so the consciousness and the moral consensus has splintered. And so it's much harder, I think, to find this, huge homogenous audience in the culture today. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I think it's a tougher road to hoe.
Just to add some stats which accentuate how large of an effect Sheen had. When he started his Catholic radio show in 1930, it reached 4 million people at its peak, which was a huge number back in the mid-20th century. And then his Life is Worth Living television show, which he started in 1951, reached over 30 million people each episode at its week. I mean, that was more viewers than Frank Sinatra, who had a show at the same time, Milton Berle, widely considered the father of modern television. So this wasn't just a little preacher with a small niche audience at a morning TV slot. This was a man who was affecting the culture in dramatic ways.
Well, and, he was darn good. You watch him now, and admittedly, the style probably wouldn't fly today the same way, but that was typical of the time. He was more dramatic. He could get away with a sort of grand oratorical gestures and so on, which would probably seem stylized and forced today. Nevertheless, listen to him and watch him. He was a master. Just recently, I watched a recording of him at the Crystal Cathedral, when Robert Schuller had him back in the 70s. And Sheen at the time, this was not long before his death. He would have been in his, mid-70s maybe. Gosh, was he a master. Just to watch him in 20 minutes without a note in front of him, but a beautifully crafted, funny when appropriate, but beautifully crafted message that was very inviting to the Protestant audience he was addressing, but never departing for a moment from the Catholic tradition, but yet reaching out as richly as he could to a Protestant audience. I was floored by it. I mean, as someone who's, a very unworthy participant in the world that he opened up, I thought, boy, that guy he's a master of that form. And, anyone that's tried it, it's like anything else. Sheen makes it look so effortless, but try it sometime. Get up and give a 20-minute talk without notes to a non-Catholic audience, if you're a Catholic bishop, in a way that is absolutely winning, faithful to your own tradition and to the gospel, draws people in. Try it sometime. It's not easy, and he was a master of it.
His method kind of reminds me of St. Paul's strategy at the Areopagus in Acts 17. We've talked about this on a couple different episodes, but he sort of assesses his audience and then tailors his evangelistic presentation to them. It doesn't mean watering down the gospel, but it does mean either emphasizing or de-emphasizing certain aspects of it. Talk about, how we as Catholics, we need to assess who we're speaking with, whether there's individual friends or larger audiences, and strategically arrange our message to cater to the audience.
Yeah, what's cool about Sheen is he could be harsh. I mean, read his books, but watch some of the videos too. He could be very sharp in his critique. Think of the way he went after communism. But I think people remember correctly that his general approach was more positive. It was what I would call a semina verbi, a seeds of the word approach that was grounded in the Fathers and in Thomas Aquinas, that you'd look for elements of the Christian thing that are available in the wider or more secular culture. And Sheen was a master at that. During his time, I remember Cardinal George often said this about Sheen. During his time, so mid-20th century America, what was very much in the popular mind was psychology. We take it now for granted because it's been so popularized. But at his time, Freud and Jung and Adler and that kind of psychodynamic way of looking at life was just kind of coming into vogue. And Sheen, in a very clever way, used that. Sometimes critically, sometimes appreciatively, but used it. The anti-communism, too, was in a certain way a seed of the word because he saw that all Americans, of whatever your religious background, could appreciate what was dehumanizing about communism. And he was appealing to the implicit Christian anthropology, I think, in people's minds. And he was doing that in his critique of communism. So he was a master at that patristic style of evangelizing.
Sheen obviously took advantage of the new and emerging media of his day, which was radio and television. How do you think he'd respond to today's new media? Would Sheen have a Facebook profile, a YouTube channel? Would we see him on Instagram and Snapchat? How do you think he'd use today's new media?
Oh, I think he'd be very open to it. Because keep in mind, in his own time, there were a lot of people that didn't think Catholic preachers should be on the radio or certainly on television. There are people who thought he was, it was a crude popularizing. It was pandering to people too much. It was not getting the density of the message across. Many of the things you'll hear today about those of us who use the new media to propagate the faith, Sheen heard those critiques too in the mid-20th century. I think he'd be right in the forefront. I think he'd delight in them, and he'd want to use them. The great Christian preachers have always used the technology available to them, whether it was ink and papyrus in Paul's time or Roman roads, or amphitheaters. Paul used that. Sheen used, as you say, radio and TV. I don't know why he wouldn't use this explosive new technology we have today. I've often said I can reach with a single YouTube video or a podcast an audience that Sheen never dreamed possible. He'd have to get people to listen or watch at a very particular time to get the Catholic message up 24/7. That's no small thing.
Fulton Sheen, in addition to his media work, was a prolific author. He wrote over 70 books throughout his career. And an interesting side note, his very first book, which was called God and Intelligence and Modern Philosophy, featured a foreword by G.K. Chesterton, who was a good friend of his. Sheen went over to Chesterton's funeral over to England. So they had a good relationship, and you see that sparkling wit show up throughout Sheen's writings. One of Sheen's books, though, and it's one that I'd have to say doesn't get as much attention and appreciation as it deserves, is titled The Mystical Body of Christ. Now, Ave Maria Press just re-released this book about a year ago, and you wrote an introduction to this book, sort of setting it in its context historically, but also highlighting some of the major keys to this book and why it's so important. So talk a little bit about this book from Sheen.
Yeah, it's a darn good book. I've read a number of Sheen's books. His best is the Life of Christ, I think. But this book came to me from Ave Maria, was reissuing it and invited me to read it. And I was, right away interested. And I knew, of course, that he had this academic background. But I read the book. I remember I had it in loose leaf pages, and I was lugging around airports at the time. But I was reading it with tremendous interest and underlining and notating it, carefully. It's a book that comes out of the liturgical movement that was all the rage in the earlier part of the 20th century. So Sheen writes that book, is it 1930, something like that, 35? And the liturgical movement was emphasizing a more organic understanding of a church, less institutional and hierarchical and more organic. So naturally it went to the Pauline image of the body, right? The Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, the mystical body. And what he showed thereby was the way the church is an integrated form of life. I'm the vine, you're the branches, Jesus says, and eat my body and drink my blood. We're not just in a kind of juridical relationship to Jesus. We're in an organic relationship to him. We live in him. He lives in us. So Sheen rang the changes on that theme as you move through ecclesiology. So he talks about Pope, he talks about infallibility, he talks about the church's social action, all these different themes. As I was reading, I thought, it's dated in some ways, but heck, if I were teaching ecclesiology, I'd use it as a textbook for the class. I'd say, why don't we all read this together and really plow through it? So I loved it. That was a very fine book. I didn't realize now, you just said, I knew that Chesterton wrote the preface for his first book. I didn't know Sheen went to his funeral.
He did, yeah.
In 1936. Having just been over there, we're filming, and we filmed at the grave of Chesterton. I was just, my imagination was delighting in the picture of a young Fulton Sheen standing around that grave, Well,
it reminds me of something we talked about a couple episodes back about the relationships within the church in the spirit of the mystical body of Christ that trickled down through generations. So Sheen was sort of the bridge between the Ronald Knoxes, the G.K. Chestertons of the world, and today's apologists and evangelists who learn from Sheen. And so it's this beautiful connection through the generations of all these great apologists and evangelists.
It's true, isn't it? Yeah, and you're right about people like Knox. And Sheen is not unlike Ronald Knox. I mean, a great preacher, a graceful writer, super smart, but not like technically academic. They're like Chesterton too, who's a genius, but didn't write in a technically academic way. Sheen did that to a degree, but most of his writing is of the more lyrical, poetic, popular genre. But darn smart and very well informed. That's a very good combination if you're doing this kind of work.
Let's focus now on Sheen's spiritual life. It's always a temptation for those of us involved with the media to just become activists, to take the Martha approach rather than the Mary approach. But Sheen blended these two together so well, perhaps most obviously through his daily holy hour. So what is this, and talk about what it meant to Sheen?
Yeah, he's the father of the holy hour, I think. And simple idea, which is every single day, Sheen urged priests first, and he really urged anyone listening to him, every single day, spend 1 hour of continual prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. Now, you could fill up that hour in any number of ways. He said, if you're a priest, pray your office before the Blessed Sacrament, and then maybe work on your homily. Read the readings for the coming Sunday. And he said, your mind will sparkle with ideas. Pray for people who've asked you to pray for them. Just sit and do what they call today a kind of radiation therapy. I mean, just let the presence of the Lord wash over you. Do any number of things during the holy hour, but make the resolution to do it every day. And Sheen has been recommending that since, I don't know, maybe the 1940s or 50s. He said he closed every priest retreat with that recommendation. I picked up that habit. Now, whenever I do a talk to priests, I'll carry forth the Sheen thing. In the seminary where I was for many years, where I was a rector for 3 years, the students have gotten this. My generation didn't. Again, we didn't know Sheen that well. If you asked someone in my time in the seminary, have you done your holy hour today? We wouldn't have been quite sure what you were talking about. But the younger people, they got the message from Sheen. And boy, is it widely practiced among young priests and seminarians. I think it's one of the most important contributions that he's made. And it's funny, he probably wouldn't have seen that in his own lifetime. How wonderful, by the way. Those of us who are involved in this kind of work to think, gosh, maybe it's in 50 years or maybe in 100 years, someone will pick up, what I was recommending or something that I said. This is a prime example in Sheen's case.
He says in his autobiography that the day he was ordained, he made a promise to God that he would do a holy hour with the Lord every day. And he claims at the end of his life that he never missed a day. Now, this is remarkable given the craziness of what traveling was like back then. He would always have to rush and find a tabernacle somewhere, but he never missed a day.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. And I have the practice now. And toward the second half of his life, Sheen was a bishop and lived in a residence that had the Blessed Sacrament. I have that privilege here in Santa Barbara. And, every morning I get up and get my coffee and I go into the chapel and I spend an hour in prayer, which now I find delightful. I know when you're starting the holy hour, a lot of the students talk about this. It can be really difficult, especially for younger people today who are so wired in and all their gizmos and constant stimulation from every possible, information source. To just sit still is challenging. And people will say, I can do a holy 15 minutes, but then I get pretty restless. Hang in there, Sheen would say, hang in there. Like a soldier who's sent to his post, and keep guard for the next hour. I'm tired after 20 minutes. Well, so what? I think it's a hugely important spiritual practice. Just recently here in Los Angeles, we have a great custom, I think. When the new guys are assigned for their first assignment, the new priests, they gather around a table with the auxiliary bishops and the archbishop. And then the envelope is opened and we hear what the assignment is. Everybody applauds. And then the archbishop says, okay, could all the bishops here give some advice to these young guys? And so we did. And it was really good advice, I must say, that I heard from all these bishops. When they came to me, I said, do a holy hour every day. And I said, it's more important than any meeting you go to. Structure your day around the holy hour, not vice versa, and you'll be a healthy and happy priest.
Let's close here with one personal question for you. Sheen, for about 15 years in the 1950s, 1960s, was an auxiliary bishop, like you, of a large archdiocese, like you. And during that period, he regularly delivered the Tre Ore talks at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. You recently got to deliver those same talks from the same pulpit. So tell us what the Tre Ore is and then what that experience was like.
Oh, yeah. It's a lovely custom. It just means the 3 hours that Jesus is on the cross from noon until 3. And so a lot of churches on Good Friday will have one of these prayer services. And what it comes down to usually is a preaching on the 7 last words. So what Jesus said from the cross. And then they're interrupted by musical pieces and meditative things and so on. So it lasts for 3 hours. And you're preaching, let's say, on the 7 last words. Each one's about 10 minutes. It's a good amount of preaching, and then interspersed with music. So Sheen did it, and I was invited by Cardinal Dolan now, how many, is it 3 years ago or 4 years ago maybe? And I went to St. Patrick's, and it was a thrill to be in that pulpit that Sheen and many other great preachers have occupied. And I'll never forget it. It was one of the great moments of my life as a priest and a preacher to be in that place. And I must say, St. Patrick's Cathedral was jammed. It was jammed full of people. I think it seats about 3,000, and it was jammed. So it was deeply moving to me. And of course, Sheen is buried right there. He's right behind the high altar at St. Patrick's. So his body was within a few yards of me as I was giving these sermons. And he's, before giving them, I went down to the crypt there and prayed for Sheen's intercession. But no, it was unforgettable.
Time now for our regular question from one of our listeners. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, please visit the website askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question there on your phone, your computer, your tablet, and each episode we choose one to play here on the air. Today, in the spirit of Fulton Sheen, we have a great question from a new deacon who's wondering what Bishop Barron does to prepare for his weekly homily. So here's the question.
Bishop Barron, I'm a fairly new deacon in the church, and I get to do homilies once a month. I was wondering, what is your process for preparing a homily? Do you have a certain methodology that you use every time? Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that question. Step one is prayer. And I mean that very seriously and not in a perfunctory way. But you ask God. My prayer is, Lord, give me the words you want me to say. Give me the words that you want me to say. Pray in a very pointed way as you begin your preparation, but also pray during the holy hour, all during the week, that everything I say, Lord, be in accord with your will. So prayer is step one, is the most important. Step two for me is Lectio Divina. So that four-step process of praying with the readings. And you know how that works, where you, Lectio, the slow, deliberate reading of the text, then allowing some word or some phrase from the text that has struck you to stay in your mind and to chew on it, to ruminate, and then to listen as God speaks, and then speak back to God. So that those four steps in the Lectio Divina process, it means really reading prayerfully and carefully the text in front of you. The great temptation for a preacher, I think, is, oh, yep, got it, that's the text. Yeah, oh yeah, I know that story. Got a couple ideas, and I'll just develop those, and I got it. No, take the time to approach the text slowly and ruminatively. Third step for me is a kind of almost free association, let the words tumble out. What are ideas, connections, narrative overtones, links to other parts of the Bible? What's like just percolating in your mind as these phrases and stories, sink in? And be creative, just be crazy, just let it go and put these things down on the page. Next step for me then is organizing that into some sort of argument or narrative. I play a lot with Aristotle's logos, pathos, and ethos are the three things you need in a good communication. Well, the first one is logos, which means it's got to make sense. There's got to be a reason, a ratio. There's something like an argument. If a sermon is simply out of that step of just letting things tumble out of your brain, that's not a good sermon. And I think actually that's what happens a lot is preachers never move from that stage to the ratio stage. So I tried then to get that organized. Then I try to memorize those points or that outline. Not strictly like word for word, but I tried at least to get the basic moves of that memorized so I can then get up and deliver the sermon coherently. There I'm following Sheen as well. Sheen, who carefully wrote out his homilies, but then never used the text. And I realize that won't work for everybody. I get that. But if you can, I would jettison the text once you've done all this preparatory work and then speak. That's roughly the method I use.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire Show. For more resources tied into this episode, please visit wordonfireshow.com. We have links to videos from Fulton Sheen, links to all the books that we've mentioned here. So please visit the website, click on this episode, and find all the extra resources there. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.